expedition stumbled upon a plane that had disappeared decades ago. When they broke through the ice and went inside, something happened that no one was prepared for. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The wind howled across the desolate coast of Labrador, carving ripples into the snow like the tide once did on forgotten sand. Inside, a weather-beaten shack by the harbor, a single yellow lamp burned against the darkness. Its light glinted off brass instruments, coils of rope, and the cracked dial of a shortwave radio. The room smelled of oil, salt, and the quiet decay of years. Sitting before the radio, his back bent like an anchor chain, was Solomon Gray, a man whose skin bore the color of old mahogany, and whose hands still trembled with the rhythm of the sea. He had spent his life chasing horizons. 40 years before, he had been one of the best navigators the North Atlantic had ever seen, a man who could read currents like words on a page. But now the sea had taken everything from him: his youth, his wife, and, most cruelly, his brother. Solomon's brother, Isaiah, had been a pilot, proud, laughing, impossible to pin down. One winter, his plane vanished over the Atlantic, somewhere between Lisbon and Montreal. No wreckage, no signal, nothing. The official reports said the ocean had swallowed it whole, but Solomon never believed that. He carried the loss like ballast in his chest, too heavy to lift, too deep to forget. Now, long after he'd stopped expecting answers, he found comfort in the static murmur of the radio. At night, when the world turned to ice and the harbor froze into silence, he sat listening to the ghost frequencies, the hums and hisses that flickered like whispers from another realm. He told himself they were just echoes from faraway storms or broken transmitters, but a small part of him still hoped that one night the sea might speak back. That night, it did. It began as a faint pulse, a single note buried in the static. Solomon frowned, adjusting the knobs with hands that had learned patience through a lifetime at sea. The signal stuttered, faded, then returned stronger. A pattern emerged, distinct and deliberate. He froze, heart thundering. He knew that rhythm: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. He leaned forward, every breath misting in the lamplight. The signal repeated, accompanied by a broken series of coordinates. Solomon scribbled them down on a notepad, the pencil trembling in his hand. The location lay far to the north, well into the Arctic Circle, beyond known shipping routes in a region of shifting ice fields. He sat motionless for a long time, the radio's hiss filling the space like the breath of something unseen. His mind told him it was interference, some reflection off the ionosphere. But his gut, the same instinct that had saved him through decades of storms, whispered otherwise. He could almost hear Isaiah's voice, calm, teasing, "Don't you dare let me vanish, brother." When morning came, the sea was steel gray and silent. Solomon stood on the pier, the coordinates in his pocket, staring north. The gulls wheeled above like restless spirits. He knew there was no peace waiting for him here, only the ache of time. Perhaps that signal, whether real or imagined, was a summons, a call from the past. At the port, 2 towns away, he heard of a scientific expedition preparing to sail north to study the melting of ancient ice shelves, an operation led by the Canadian Arctic Research Division called Project Northern Echo. The name itself felt like fate's whisper. He walked the 20 miles to their base, boots crunching over the frostbitten road, and found their ship, a sturdy icebreaker named Resolute. The crew eyed him with curiosity when he asked to join. He looked like a relic from another era, wrapped in an old navy coat with salt-stained cuffs, a thick wool cap pulled over gray curls, his eyes sharp despite the years. The expedition leader, Dr. Claire Manning, studied him for a long time before speaking. "We already have a navigator," she said finally. Solomon didn't argue. He simply handed her his old seafarer's logbook, the one filled with hand-drawn Arctic maps, notes on currents, and storm patterns older than most of her instruments. She flipped through the pages, her skepticism slowly giving way to intrigue. "You've sailed the Greenland Channel," she murmured. "Twice," he said quietly, "and lived." Her mouth twitched into something like a smile. That night, Solomon packed his few belongings, the radio, a locket with his wife's picture, and the worn brass compass Isaiah had given him before his last flight. As dawn bled across the horizon, he stepped aboard resolute, the deck humming beneath his feet, and felt a familiar pulse in his veins, the pull of the sea, the hum of destiny. The journey north began beneath skies of frozen glass. As the icebreaker plowed through the floes, Solomon stood at the bow, watching the horizon dissolve into white. The sound of the engines and the rhythm of the waves filled him with something close to peace. Yet, deep inside, a storm was building. He could not shake the thought that the signal had been meant for him, and that, somewhere beneath that endless expanse of ice, his brothers still waited. Days passed in silence. The crew worked efficiently, running sonar scans, collecting core samples, laughing around rationed coffee. They treated Solomon with polite distance, unsure what to make of the quiet old man who stared too long at the frozen distance. He didn't mind. He was used to solitude. One night, unable to sleep, he returned to the radio room. The Arctic air was so cold it made the metal walls ring. He tuned the frequencies again, his breath fogging the glass. For hours there was nothing but static, until suddenly the same signal burst through. This time it was louder, clearer, the same coordinates, the same SOS. Solomon's pulse quickened. He checked the ship's navigation logs. The numbers matched almost perfectly with their projected course, just 2 days' travel ahead. It was as if something under the ice was calling them forward. When he showed the readings to Dr. Manning in the morning, she frowned but didn't dismiss him outright. "Could be residual interference from an old transmitter buried under the ice," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But if there's a metallic mass in that region, our instruments will confirm it." Her tone was scientific, but Solomon caught a flicker in her eyes, the spark of curiosity, the same hunger that had driven explorers for centuries. That night, as the Resolute cut deeper into the Arctic labyrinth, the aurora bloomed overhead like a river of fire and emerald. The crew gathered on deck in silence, watching the heavens shimmer. Solomon stood apart, eyes on the northern horizon. The green light danced across the ice, and for an instant he thought he saw a silhouette, the faint outline of an aircraft's wing rising ghost-like from beneath the frost. When he blinked, it was gone. The radio crackled again that night, the SOS growing faint as though sinking back beneath the ice. But Solomon no longer doubted. He knew what awaited them in that frozen wasteland. Somewhere under the Arctic sky, between the whispers of the storm and the slow turning of time, the past had begun to stir. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind, and in it he could almost hear Isaiah's laughter again, echoing from a world suspended in ice. The icebreaker, Resolute, pressed northward through the gray wasteland of the Arctic Ocean, her reinforced hull groaning under the strain of the pack ice. The sound was like the deep breathing of the planet itself, long and slow and ancient. Each impact sent vibrations through the deck plates and into the soles of Solomon's boots as he stood near the bow, watching the pale horizon shift and tremble. The sky hung low, heavy with the weight of frozen clouds, and the air was so sharp it felt like glass in his lungs. He had been at sea most of his life, but the Arctic was another world entirely. Cold, absolute, without forgiveness or sound. Behind him, life continued aboard the ship. The hum of generators, the rhythmic crunch of boots on steel, and the clipped, efficient voices of the crew carried through the corridors like a heartbeat. The expedition had been assembled from several countries, scientists, technicians, and sailors bound by curiosity and ambition. To most of them, this was a professional venture, a calculated leap into the unknown. But to Solomon, it was something else entirely. Every gust of wind, every crack in the ice, seemed to whisper a name he had not spoken aloud in decades. Isaiah. Dr. Claire Manning ran the operation with a precision that impressed even Solomon. She was in her late 30s, pale-skinned and sharp-featured, with hair the color of steel and eyes that missed nothing. She had built her reputation on logic, discipline, and an unshakable belief that everything had an explanation. On the bridge, she moved between screens and maps with the grace of a commander who trusted only data. When she spoke, Solomon watched her quietly at times, noting how she always kept her distance from the crew. She belonged to no one and needed no one. There was something in that isolation that mirrored his own. Yet he could sense that beneath her confidence there lingered a hunger for discovery, for legacy, for the kind of truth that could outlast her name. The rest of the team filled the spaces between her precision. Raphael Chen, the aeronautical engineer, was quick-minded and skeptical, a man who loved equations more than people. His dark hair was always perfectly combed, his voice clipped with sarcasm, but even he had moments when wonder broke through the cynicism. Amelia Torres, the young biologist from Buenos Aires, brought warmth to the cold corridors. She had a laugh that seemed to thaw the frost on the walls and a way of listening that made others feel less alone. The radio technician, Oscar Hayes, was broad-shouldered and unshaven, a veteran of too many winters. He swore freely, drank too much coffee, and knew more about the moods of the ice than he let on. They all looked at Solomon differently. Some saw him as a relic, an old man drawn north by nostalgia. Others, like Amelia, treated him with quiet respect. She often asked him about the stars, about navigation before satellites and digital compasses. He told her that back then, a sailor's instruments were his instincts, and the sky itself was a map. She smiled at that, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of the years lift. Days blurred together. The ship moved between shifting walls of ice that rose like cathedrals, pale blue under the dim sun. The wind carried the scent of salt and eternity. Each morning, the scientists took readings and measurements, drilling core samples, monitoring atmospheric changes. At night, the temperature dropped until breath crystallized mid-air. The world became utterly silent, and the aurora would appear, green ribbons dancing above the ship, vast and silent, like some ancient script written across the sky. It was on one of those nights that the first anomaly appeared. The radar picked up an unusual echo far to the northeast, a dense mass buried beneath the ice shelf. At first, the data was dismissed, most likely a geological formation or a false reading caused by magnetic interference. But Solomon, hearing the coordinates, felt his heart tighten. They were almost identical to the ones from the signal he had recorded. When he brought this up to Dr. Manning the next morning, she regarded him with that same clinical calm. "We'll verify it," she said. "If it's real, it could be a glacial cavity, maybe a deposit of metal or minerals trapped in the ice. Either way, it's worth examining." Raphael looked less convinced. "If it's magnetic, it'll mess with the instruments," he said, frowning at the charts. "We don't want to get caught over thin ice." Solomon said nothing, though every instinct told him the reading wasn't natural. It had the same pull as the radio signal, a whisper from something that should have been long dead. He felt the same cold in his chest that he had felt the night Isaiah vanished, an ache that never truly faded. As the Resolute pressed onward, the sea changed character. The ice thickened, the sky dimmed, and the temperature fell so low that metal cracked like dry bone. The crew began to tire. Tempers shortened, and laughter grew rarer. Even Amelia's cheer dimmed under the endless gray. Still, Solomon remained calm. He had lived through worse storms, worse silences. He spent the long hours on deck, studying the color of the clouds and the drift of the ice, reading the world like scripture. Sometimes he would speak softly to the sea. The younger crewman thought it was madness, but Amelia once asked him what he was saying. He told her he was listening. "The ocean has memory," he said. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." 2 nights later, the signal returned. Solomon was alone in the radio room, the ship groaning softly in the dark. Static filled the speakers, then that same pulse. Short, long, short. The exact rhythm he had heard back home. His hands trembled as he wrote the new coordinates. They were closer now, only a few dozen miles ahead. He called Dr. Manning, who arrived with Raphael and Oscar. Together, they listened as the signal repeated, weak but undeniable. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Even Raphael looked uneasy. "That's impossible," he murmured. "There's no transmitter out here, no traffic, no stations for 1,000 kilometers." Dr. Manning's voice was calm, but her eyes were bright. "Then we're hearing something extraordinary." She ordered a course adjustment. The ship turned slightly east toward the source of the signal. The next morning, a heavy fog settled over the sea. It clung to the ship like breath on glass, thick. The ice groaned around them, and every creak sounded too close. The engines labored. Dr. Manning stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the radar, her jaw tight. Solomon joined her quietly, watching the faint shapes moving across the green screen. "What do you see out there, Mr. Gray?" she asked. He thought for a long moment before answering. "A place that remembers what it's lost." When the fog lifted hours later, the world ahead seemed different. The horizon was marked by a line of dark, uneven ridges, a frozen archipelago of icebergs, welded together by centuries of wind and snow. Somewhere beneath that vast and silent expanse, the radar indicated a solid structure, something metallic, something large. The decision to investigate came swiftly. The scientific thrill outweighed the danger. Preparations began immediately. Drilling equipment was readied, drones deployed, thermal sensors calibrated. Excitement buzzed through the ship like static. For the scientists, it was the possibility of discovery. For Solomon, it was dread wrapped in hope. That night, as the team gathered for a briefing in the galley, Dr. Manning outlined the plan. They would send a drone beneath the ice to map the structure. If the readings confirmed artificial materials, they'd establish a surface camp and begin extraction. Her voice carried confidence, but Solomon noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted her notes. After the meeting, he lingered by the observation deck, staring into the frozen darkness. The aurora shimmered faintly behind veils of mist. The world was so still it seemed suspended outside of time. Amelia joined him, her face hidden under a fur hood. "You really think it's the plane, don't you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "I think it's something that wants to be found." She was silent for a while, then smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who believes the ice can talk." "It can," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You just have to listen when everyone else stops." By dawn, the drilling team was ready. The ship's engines fell silent as they reached the coordinates. The ice beneath them was thick, gleaming blue, and unbroken. The first cores came up clean, crystalline, but at a depth of 30 meters the instruments struck metal. The sound echoed through the hull like a heartbeat. Raphael stared at the data, his skepticism crumbling. "That's not a rock formation," he whispered. "That's manufactured." Dr. Manning's face paled with excitement. "We found it," she said, almost to herself. Solomon felt the deck tilt beneath his feet as if the sea itself had shifted. He could taste the cold metal of memory in the air. Somewhere below, buried in centuries of ice, the lost echoes of a flight from another lifetime waited for them. He closed his eyes, hearing again the faint pulse of the radio signal, the voice that had drawn him here. He didn't know if it was fate, coincidence, or the stubborn will of the past refusing to die. But as the crew prepared to break through the final layers of ice, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were no longer chasing discovery. They were being led. The Arctic wind rose, howling against the steel hull as if trying to warn them away. But the engines roared again, the drills spun faster, and Resolute pressed forward into the white oblivion. Beneath the ice, something waited. And in Solomon's heart, for the first time in 40 years, the silence of loss began to crack. The drills screamed through the Arctic dawn, their vibration running up through the deck plates and into the bones of every man and woman aboard the Resolute. The air outside was brittle, colder than anything Solomon had ever known. The horizon was a smear of gray against white, a world without edges, without sound except for the wind that scraped across the ice like sandpaper over bone. The team worked in disciplined silence, breath rising in frozen clouds, eyes narrowed against the glare. It had taken them nearly 2 days of steady drilling to breach the final layer. What had first seemed to be an anomaly, perhaps a ridge of compacted permafrost, was now unmistakably artificial. Beneath the translucent blue ice, they could see straight lines, the faint curve of metal plating, and the outline of what could only be the fuselage of an aircraft. Dr. Claire Manning stood at the edge of the excavation pit, her parka hood pulled tight around her face. The cold had etched color from her lips, but her eyes gleamed with fierce triumph. "We've done it," she said softly, as though afraid her voice might shatter the fragile stillness. "We've actually found it." Raphael Chen crouched beside the pit, his gloved fingers brushing against the exposed metal. "Aluminum alloy," he murmured, awe mixing with disbelief. "Aircraft grade, judging by the curvature." Solomon didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath had caught the moment he saw the faint outline under the ice. Even through the opaque frost, he could read the ghost of the past. The shape, the dimensions, even the position of the wings. They matched too perfectly to be coincidence. Somewhere in his chest, beneath the scar tissue of years, something old and aching stirred. When they began melting the ice with portable heaters and directed steam, the frozen surface slowly bled away to reveal more of the wreckage. The nose of the aircraft jutted upward at a slight angle, as if caught mid-ascent. Its tail disappeared into the glacier. The outer skin, remarkably intact, was dulled by decades of frost, but still reflected faint light beneath the ice. The letters painted along the side were faded but legible. Aero Atlantica, Flight 209. Solomon's legs nearly gave out. He had whispered that name to the wind 1,000 times in his life. The plane his brother had flown. The flight that had vanished without a trace. For the others, this was history. For him, it was a grave. By midday, they had cleared enough of the entrance to force open one of the emergency doors. The hinges screamed like living things as they broke free. Inside, a wall of stale air escaped, dry and bitter, preserved by the cold. The scientists hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to step through. Solomon moved forward before anyone could stop him. "Mr. Gray," Dr. Manning called after him, but her voice was distant, muffled by the wind and by something larger, the pull of memory. He stepped into the fuselage, his boots crunching over a floor that glittered with frost. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the darkness, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. Rows of seats stretched before him, perfectly aligned, each one occupied by the still forms of passengers. They sat as if waiting for a landing that would never come, their faces pale and smooth beneath a thin shell of ice. Some still clutched books or handbags. One man's head rested gently against the window. The silence was unbearable. Amelia entered behind him, hand over her mouth. "My God," she whispered. Dr. Manning followed, camera trembling in her gloved grip. "It's a miracle of preservation," she breathed. "Absolute cryostasis. This shouldn't even be possible." But Solomon wasn't listening. His eyes swept the aisle, moving past the rows of frozen souls until they reached the cockpit door, sealed under layers of ice. Something inside him demanded that he see beyond that door. He placed a hand against it, feeling the cold seep through the fabric of his glove. It was real. All of it. The flight, the loss, the years of doubt. The world had tried to forget, but the ice had remembered. When Raphael joined them inside, his usual cynicism was gone. "The impact pattern suggests a controlled descent," he said quietly. "They must have gone down during a storm and froze almost instantly. The fuselage is remarkably intact. No sign of fire, no major disintegration. It's as if the ice caught them in its arms." Amelia shivered. "Then why didn't anyone find them?" "No wreckage on the surface," Dr. Manning replied absently, photographing the instruments. "The weather must have closed over the site within hours. Decades of accumulation did the rest." Solomon barely heard her. His gaze had fallen to the floor beside one of the seats. A small object, half buried in frost, caught the light. He knelt slowly, brushing away the ice until he uncovered it. A military dog tag, dull and tarnished, the letters barely visible. Isaiah Gray. For a long time, Solomon didn't move. The sounds of the others faded until there was only the steady beat of his heart and the distant groan of shifting ice. He closed his fingers around the tag and felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the heaters or the lights. It was as if a door had opened somewhere inside him, a place where grief and memory had been locked for 40 years. Dr. Manning's voice broke the spell. "Everyone out. We need to secure the site before dark." Outside, the temperature had dropped even lower. The horizon had turned the color of ash, and a faint halo of light shimmered above the glacier. They worked in pairs, documenting, photographing, and setting up sensors. For a while, there was a current of triumph running through the team, a sense that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. But as dusk deepened, that feeling began to change. It was Raphael who noticed it first, reviewing footage from one of the external cameras. He frowned, then replayed the clip. There, in the corner of the frame, was movement, a flicker, quick and uncertain, like a shadow passing across the distortion of light. But the longer he watched, the clearer it became. A figure, faint but unmistakable, moving inside the fuselage after they had left. He didn't mention it right away. He told himself it must be an error. But when Amelia came to check the footage and went pale, he knew he hadn't imagined it. They brought it to Dr. Manning, who watched in silence, her lips pressed tight. "It's a trick of reflection," she said finally, though there was no conviction in her tone. "The lens probably picked up our own lights through the ice." Solomon stood behind her, eyes on the monitor. "That's not a reflection," he said quietly. "That's someone moving." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind rose again, hissing through the metal scaffolding. The ice cracked somewhere in the distance, a deep sound that felt more alive than the still air should have allowed. That night, the team camped near the excavation site. The sky was dark, save for a few shreds of green light curling above the horizon. No one spoke much. Even Oscar, who usually filled silence with jokes, kept his head down. Solomon sat apart from the group, the dog tag turning slowly between his fingers. He could feel its weight like a heartbeat. As he stared towards the half-buried aircraft, the memories came back. His brother's voice over the radio, the last words before the transmission broke. "I'll bring her home, Solo. You'll see." He had replayed those words in his mind for years until they had become both a promise and a wound. Now, standing on the edge of that frozen grave, he realized Isaiah had kept his promise after all. The plane had come home, even if it was to a home of ice and silence. When morning came, the temperature had dropped even further, and the sky was a flat sheet of white. The crew moved carefully across the slick surface, setting up additional instruments to monitor seismic activity. Every now and then, Solomon caught them glancing toward the plane, as if expecting it to move. The unease was spreading, subtle but undeniable. By midday, Amelia approached Solomon as he was checking one of the thermal scanners. "We picked up something strange," she said. "Heat fluctuations inside the fuselage. Minimal, but there's a pattern. It's not supposed to happen in conditions like this." He studied the readout. The screen showed faint waves of infrared light moving within the cabin. Brief, flickering signatures. They weren't random. "Something's alive in there," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not alive, just echoes." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Later, when the light began to fade, the team withdrew to the base camp. The plane loomed behind them, its silver skin glinting faintly under the weak sun. For a moment, Solomon thought he saw a shape at one of the windows, a smudge of darkness, a trick of light. He blinked, and it was gone. As the generator hummed and the tents glowed softly in the twilight, Dr. Manning gathered everyone for an evening briefing. She spoke about protocols, data recovery, and the next phase of excavation. Her tone was steady, professional, but beneath her composure, Solomon sensed tension. The discovery was no longer just a scientific breakthrough. It was a mystery, one that reached beyond reason. That night, as sleep eluded him, Solomon stepped outside. The air bit at his face, and the world was eerily still. The aurora had returned, casting long emerald shadows over the snow. The plane stood half buried in the ice field, silent and immense, like a monument left by gods. He watched it for a long time, and in the shifting light he thought he saw movement again, something stirring inside, slow and deliberate, as if waking from a dream. He felt no fear, only an ache of understanding. The ice had not taken the plane to bury it, but to preserve it, to hold it for the day someone would return to listen. And now, at last, someone had. The Arctic sun never truly rose the next morning. It merely smeared a faint silver glow across the horizon, a dim promise of light that never came. The air was brittle and dry, so cold it made the skin crack around the mouth when one spoke. The excavation site lay silent beneath a film of drifting snow, the outlines of the buried aircraft just visible beneath the frost. From a distance, it looked like some vast metallic creature sleeping under glass, caught between the world of the living and the dead. The team moved quietly, each step a dull crunch on the ice, as if even sound itself had frozen. Dr. Manning stood beside the fuselage, her breath fogging in the pale air. The images from the night before still played through her mind, that faint shadow captured by the camera moving within the aircraft after everyone had left. She told herself it was an optical illusion, a trick of reflection or interference, but the thought refused to leave her. The Arctic had a way of distorting reality, of turning reason to dust beneath the weight of its silence. Solomon, too, had slept little. He sat apart from the others, his back against a snow tractor, watching the plane as though afraid to blink. The dog tag lay heavy in his pocket. Every time the wind shifted, he thought he heard something, a hollow creak, a sigh, coming from within the fuselage. Sometimes he told himself it was the ice settling. Other times he wasn't so sure. When dawn thickened into its strange, eternal twilight, Dr. Manning ordered a new set of scans. Raphael set up the thermal imaging equipment again, muttering under his breath about malfunctioning sensors and electromagnetic interference. Amelia helped him, her gloved fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the calibrations. Oscar stayed near the perimeter, radio in hand, his usual jokes replaced by curt silence. The only sound was the hum of machinery and the steady whisper of snow brushing against metal. The thermal readings came back erratic. The same faint heat fluctuations appeared again, low and pulsing, deep within the plane. It was impossible. The interior temperature should have been uniformly sub-zero. Raphael ran the scan twice more, convinced it was an error, but the pattern persisted. A pulse, a rhythm. Amelia's voice was barely a whisper. "It's like something's breathing." Dr. Manning ignored her tone, though she felt the same chill run down her spine. Could be trapped gases expanding as the structure shifts. Perfectly natural, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. By midday, the wind had risen, carrying shards of ice that stung the face like needles. The team huddled in the shelter tent for warmth, the generator rumbling beside them. Solomon sat near the entrance, watching the storm gather. The conversation behind him drifted between nervous speculation and forced humor. "What if it's some kind of wildlife?" Amelia said. "A polar fox, maybe? Or a bear that fell through the ice years ago and somehow ended up—" Raphael laughed, sharp and quick. "A bear with opposable thumbs, maybe, unless it learned how to open aircraft doors." Even Oscar cracked a thin smile, though it didn't last. "Whatever it is, I don't like it. There's something off about that plane. Feels wrong, like it's watching us. Enough, Dr. Manning said firmly. We're scientists, not children telling ghost stories. But Solomon finally turned to face her, his eyes calm and dark. Ghost stories begin somewhere, he said softly, usually where people stop listening to what the world is trying to tell them. The tent fell silent. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin metal poles. Somewhere beyond the storm, the ice groaned, a deep, slow sound that carried through the ground like thunder from the underworld. When the storm eased hours later, visibility returned only partially. The world was veiled in a thin white haze. Dr. Manning decided to continue documenting the site before the next weather front rolled in. The team moved out again, checking instruments, securing samples, photographing the wreck. Solomon followed quietly, scanning the horizon as if expecting something to emerge from the snow. Near the aircraft's tail, he noticed something that made him stop. The surface of the snow was disturbed, not by wind, but by movement. A faint line of impressions led away from the plane, half covered by fresh snowfall. They were not boot prints. They were too large, too uneven, and spaced as though whatever made them had moved on 4 limbs rather than 2. He crouched to study them more closely. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, the ridges untouched by drift. Whatever had made them had passed here recently, perhaps within hours. Amelia approached from behind, her breath catching as she saw them. "Those aren't human," she whispered. Solomon didn't answer. He simply followed the direction they led, his body moving before his mind could protest. The tracks curved around the rear of the plane and vanished into a slope of snow that rose towards the glacier ridge. When he looked up, the faint mist there seemed to ripple, as though something large had just moved beyond sight. Raphael's voice broke through the radio static. "Gray, where the hell are you going?" "There are tracks," Solomon replied. "Something's been here." "Stay where you are," Dr. Manning ordered, But Solomon didn't stop. Something compelled him forward, a pull stronger than caution. He had followed tracks like these before, long ago, in jungles, deserts, and frozen seas. But this trail was different. It felt deliberate, leading him somewhere. The others caught up with him minutes later, their breaths ragged in the thin air. Dr. Manning's anger faltered when she saw the prints for herself. She crouched low, brushed snow away, and frowned. "They're too deep for an animal this far inland, and too distinct. Whatever made them isn't small." Oscar scanned the area with his rifle raised, though he knew it would do little against the Arctic's true predators. "If it's a bear, it's a big one," he said quietly. Solomon's gaze lingered on the white emptiness ahead. "No," he murmured. "Bears don't move like this. These prints circle before they leave. Something was watching." That word hung in the air, heavy as the frost. Watching. They returned to camp before dark, shaken but unwilling to admit it. The footage of the tracks was stored, cataloged, and explained away in the logbook as possible wildlife interference. But none of them believed that. As night came, unease crept into every shadow. The plane loomed over them, a frozen sentinel against the flickering green sky. Solomon could not sleep. The wind outside the tent was relentless, clawing at the fabric, carrying strange echoes across the valley. Sometimes it sounded like whispers, other times like footsteps crunching softly in the snow. When he looked out through the small opening in the tent, he saw nothing but the pale outline of the aircraft. Yet, he could not shake the feeling that something moved just beyond the range of vision. In the early hours, a sharp sound tore through the silence, a single metallic clang like a blow against the plane's hull. The camp erupted. Lights flashed on. People stumbled from their tents, breath steaming in the frigid air. Dr. Manning barked orders, her voice tight with fear disguised as authority. "Stay in pairs," she commanded. "Oscar, check the generator. Raphael, with me." Solomon was already moving toward the plane. The sound had come from the forward section near the cockpit. The snow there was freshly disturbed again, the tracks more numerous now, looping around the fuselage like a ritual. His flashlight caught movement. A flicker, a shape darting between the mounds of ice. He froze. The light trembled in his hand. For an instant, he saw what looked like a human silhouette, tall, lean, wrapped in rags of white. Then it was gone, swallowed by the storm of snow that rose suddenly, violently, as though the air itself sought to erase it. When Dr. Manning and Raphael reached him, the shape had vanished. Only the wind remained, howling through the open cabin door. Inside, they found nothing new, only the frozen passengers staring ahead with glassy eyes. Yet, Solomon's flashlight caught something different now. The frost that had sealed the cockpit door was cracked, as if someone had struck it from within. They retreated in silence, none willing to speak of what they thought they'd seen. Back in the safety of the camp, Dr. Manning called it a hallucination, a result of exhaustion and cold. Raphael agreed too quickly. Amelia said nothing, her face pale. Solomon simply stared at the horizon, where the faint trail of prints disappeared into the white void. By morning, the storm had calmed again. The Arctic was deceptively serene, its silence too perfect to trust. The tracks were gone, erased overnight by the shifting snow. It was as if the earth itself had decided to hide its secrets once more. They resumed their work with mechanical precision, though everyone's movements were slower now, their conversations quieter. Even Dr. Manning's sharpness had dulled. Her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. They all felt it, the invisible pressure of something unseen, circling just beyond reach. As evening came, Solomon counted the frozen bodies again inside the plane. He read the flight manifest aloud to himself, tracing the names with a gloved finger. 98 passengers. But when he looked around, he could only find 93. 5 were missing. He stared at the empty seats where ice should have held them. The straps were still buckled, the frost unbroken. Yet the bodies were gone. For a long time he stood in that frozen silence, unable to move. Then he turned and looked out through the shattered window at the endless white beyond. The storm clouds were returning, heavy and dark, and somewhere in the distance he thought he saw movement again, slow, deliberate, human in shape. He whispered his brother's name into the wind. "I'm here, Isaiah." The answer came not in words, but in the deep, mournful groan of the ice beneath his feet, as though the Arctic. The following day began with a sky the color of lead. The faint light of dawn seemed to hang motionless above the frozen landscape, as if even the sun had grown weary of shining on such emptiness. The air was dense with silence, and each breath of wind carried a warning that no one dared to voice aloud. The team had grown quieter with each passing hour. Their discovery, once a miracle of science and perseverance, had turned into something heavy and suffocating. They no longer worked with the same eagerness. Every clang of metal, every whisper of the wind seemed to echo too loudly. Even the plane itself, now fully exposed, appeared to watch them with hollow windows for eyes. Dr. Manning stood at the edge of the excavation site, her gloved hands clenched around the tablet displaying their latest readings. For all her training and composure, the data unnerved her. The ice around the wreck was shifting in ways that defied the usual glacial rhythm. Layers were cracking where they should have remained stable, as if the earth beneath them was restless. She told herself it was a result of temperature fluctuation, but deep down she felt something else at work, something that had waited beneath the surface for too long. Solomon moved slowly across the camp, checking ropes and equipment, though his thoughts were far from the tasks at hand. He had barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the missing passengers, not their faces, but the empty spaces they had left behind. He had gone back to count them 3 times during the night, hoping he'd made an error, but the numbers did not change. 5 seats stood vacant. The belts were still clasped. The frost on them was undisturbed. It was impossible, yet he knew what he had seen. When he told Dr. Manning, she stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're exhausted," she said finally. "We all are. We'll document the remains again once the weather clears. The ice plays tricks on the mind." Solomon said nothing. He had learned long ago that some truths only revealed themselves to those willing to listen in silence. By midday, the sky had begun to darken in an unnatural way. Clouds rolled in low and fast, thick as bruises. The wind sharpened, cutting across the ice fields in long howls that sounded almost like voices. Oscar muttered about pressure drops and bad omens. Raphael checked his instruments and cursed softly. "It's not just wind," he said, staring at the barometer. "There's a pressure collapse coming, a big one." They had no time to prepare. Within the hour, the storm descended on them like a living thing. The first gust hit with enough force to knock the tent sideways. The icebreaker, anchored a few miles off the coast, radioed a warning before contact was lost entirely. The storm swallowed their signals, devouring every frequency and static. Snow turned the air opaque, and visibility dropped to nothing. The wind screamed so loudly that shouting was useless. The camp disintegrated into chaos, equipment blown across the ice, ropes snapping like whip cracks, figures stumbling through the whiteout with hands over their faces. Dr. Manning shouted for everyone to gather near the supply crates, using them as a makeshift barrier. She moved with a commander's instinct, forcing herself to remain calm even as fear clawed at her chest. The storm had come too suddenly, too violently. This wasn't weather. It was fury. Through the blinding swirl of snow, Solomon saw the faint outline of the plane, half buried and shuddering under the assault of the wind. The ice around it groaned, and a thin mist began to rise from the cracks. Steam, or perhaps something colder than steam. A strange light seemed to shimmer beneath the fuselage, a blue pulse that made his skin prickle. He felt a tug deep within, a compulsion that overpowered reason. The others might have seen a dying relic of the past, but he saw something alive. He stepped forward into the storm, ignoring the shouts behind him. Snow clung to his eyelashes, and the wind stole the air from his lungs, but he kept moving. He reached the side of the plane, pressed his palm against its frozen skin, and felt a vibration, faint but steady like the thrum of a heartbeat. For a moment, he thought he heard something else too, a low, rhythmic tapping from within, as though someone were knocking to be let out. "Solomon!" Amelia's voice cut through the wind, thin but desperate. She was running toward him, her coat flapping wildly. Behind her came Oscar, dragging a rope. They reached him just as a deafening crack split the air. The ice under their feet shifted, a massive slab breaking loose with a sound like the earth's spine snapping. They fell hard, sliding down a shallow incline toward. When Solomon regained his footing, Amelia was beside him, eyes wide with terror. The plane loomed above them, tilted slightly now as if awakening from its frozen grave. The groaning of the ice grew louder. "We have to get out of here," she shouted, but Solomon's gaze was fixed on something else. A door at the rear of the fuselage half hidden by snow. It was open. He didn't remember seeing it open before. A dark passage yawned beyond it, the air inside unnaturally still. Against the chaos of the storm, the open doorway seemed impossible, untouched by snow or wind. He moved toward it before Amelia could stop him. Inside, the darkness swallowed him whole. The beam of his flashlight cut through clouds of frost, revealing narrow aisles lined with broken seats. The passengers who had once been there were gone, their shapes imprinted in the ice like shadows left by heat. He felt dizzy, the silence pressing against his ears until even his own heartbeat sounded too loud. At the far end of the cabin, something flickered in the dim light. A figure, small, hunched, frozen mid-movement, as if caught running. For a fleeting moment, he thought it was one of the missing passengers. Then the light shifted, and he saw that it wasn't human. The thing's shape was all wrong, its limbs too long, its head bowed as though searching for something on the floor. The sight struck him like a physical blow, and he stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. When he looked again, the shape was gone. Only empty rows and the dull shimmer of frost remained. Outside, the storm's roar grew louder. He heard Amelia calling his name again, her voice breaking with panic. He turned, stumbling back through the open door, just as a section of ice gave way beneath the plane's nose. The fuselage lurched, the ground shifting violently. Amelia and Oscar pulled him up by the rope, dragging him away from the cracking edge. Behind them, the aircraft groaned once more, and the sound was so human, so mournful, that all three froze. By the time they reached the shelter of the supply crates, Dr. Manning and Raphael were there, both pale and windburned. The scientist's hair clung to her forehead, and her voice trembled despite her effort to sound composed. "We can't stay here," she said. "We'll freeze before the storm passes. We need cover." "The plane," Raphael suggested, but she shook her head violently. "No, not there. The stress on the ice is too high. If the fissures widen, it'll go under." Oscar swore under his breath. "Then where?" Solomon was still staring into the white veil of snow, his mind half in the present, half lost in the darkness he'd just left. He thought again of the open door, the empty seats, the strange figure crouched among the rows. He wasn't sure if it had been real, but he couldn't rid himself of the feeling that the storm itself had driven it out, or back in. In the chaos that followed, the team split. Dr. Manning led Amelia and Raphael toward the ridge where a shallow ice cave had been charted earlier in the week. Oscar stayed behind to secure what equipment he could. Solomon hesitated before following, casting one last look at the plane. It stood there like a monument in the snow, defiant and eternal, yet somehow smaller now, diminished by the storm that raged around it. He could almost imagine the ice closing back over it, sealing away its secrets again. They reached the cave just before dusk, if dusk could be called that gray thickening of the sky that marked the end of another Arctic day. Inside, the walls glowed faintly with trapped light, and the air was slightly warmer. They built a small fire from emergency fuel and huddled together in silence, listening to the wind batter the entrance. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Amelia broke the quiet. "I saw something out there," she said softly, "before we fell. It wasn't an animal." Raphael scoffed weakly. "Stress, cold, exhaustion. We're all seeing things." But Dr. Manning didn't reply. She sat with her hands around a cup of melted snow, staring into the fire. In the flickering glow, her face looked older, the sharpness replaced by something closer to fear. When the storm finally began to die down hours later, they stepped outside to assess the damage. The wind had slowed, but the world was unrecognizable. The camp was buried under drifts of snow, the equipment scattered, half frozen in place. The plane still stood, though its tail section had sunk deeper into the ice. The open door at the rear was closed now, sealed tight as if it had never moved. The radio crackled faintly to life, but all that came through was static. No word from the ship. No signal from Oscar, who had not yet returned. Dr. Manning's expression hardened. But Solomon knew morning would bring more than they were prepared for. He could feel it in the stillness, in the strange hum beneath his feet. The ice was not resting. It was alive, shifting, whispering in a voice too old and too vast to understand. That night, as he lay awake near the dying fire, he thought he heard something above the wind, a soft, rhythmic sound like footsteps crunching in the snow. They came closer, paused near the mouth of the cave, then faded again. He waited for the others to stir, but no one moved. Perhaps they were too tired, or perhaps he was the only one who could hear them. When dawn finally came, the first weak light revealed a new set of tracks outside the cave. They were not from boots, nor from any known creature. They led from the direction of the plane, and stopped just outside the cave entrance, as if whatever had made them had stood there for a long time, watching. Solomon did not wake the others. He stood alone at the threshold, staring at the trail until the wind erased it grain by grain. He had the strange, certain feeling that the storm had not been meant to destroy them, but to reveal something, to strip away their certainties and leave them bare before whatever truth the ice was hiding. Behind him, the fire sputtered, and the wind whispered through the cavern's narrow walls. Somewhere in the distance, beneath layers of ice and time, the wreck groaned softly, like a heartbeat returning after too long a silence. Morning came without color, the sky a sheet of dull metal stretching endlessly in all directions. The world seemed to have frozen mid-motion, locked between the storm's retreat and the silence that followed. The wind had calmed, yet the cold had deepened, sinking into their bones as they prepared to leave the fragile safety of the ice cave. Snow still drifted across the plain like slow-moving smoke. Everything looked the same, featureless, infinite, but Solomon knew instinctively where they needed to go. He stood at the mouth of the cave, staring toward the faint outline of the aircraft, its form blurred by distance and frost. The open white before him seemed almost alive, breathing faintly beneath the weight of the cold. The tracks they'd seen earlier were gone, swallowed by the night's wind, but he didn't need them. Something within him, some quiet compass born of grief and instinct, pulled him onward. There was still a story waiting to be finished. Dr. Manning emerged from the shadows behind him, her face drawn, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "We'll go when the sun rises higher," she said, "if that even happens here." She tried to sound commanding, but her voice lacked its usual edge. The storm had taken more from her than sleep. It had stripped away the armor of certainty she wore so easily before. Amelia was already checking their supplies, her hands trembling slightly as she packed the last of the fuel cells. Raphael stayed apart, crouched beside the radio, trying in vain to re-establish contact with the ship. Only static answered. When at last they set out, the snow crunched softly beneath their boots, a sound swallowed quickly by the vastness around them. Solomon led, tracing a path he couldn't explain, his gloved hand brushing the frost-crusted rope that connected them. Each of them was wrapped in layers of heavy fabric and silence. The ice beneath their feet groaned occasionally, a low, mournful sound like a giant's whisper. They reached the aircraft before noon. It was half buried now, the tail nearly gone under fresh snow. The door that had once stood open was sealed tight again, rimmed with frost as though welded by time itself. The sight of it filled Solomon with unease. It was as if the plane, aware of their presence, had closed itself to them. Amelia stopped suddenly, pointing toward a rise in the snow to the north. "There," she said, "do you see it?" At first, it looked like nothing more than a distortion of the landscape, a ripple in the white. But as they drew closer, Solomon saw the dark hollow of an opening carved into the base of the glacier, a natural cavern, wide enough for a person to enter. They exchanged cautious glances. None of them spoke, but the decision was wordless. Whatever answers remained would be found there. The entrance was steep, and they descended one by one, their lamps flickering against the ice walls. The air inside was strangely warm, heavy with the faint scent of mineral water and something else, something faintly organic, like old decay. The walls shimmered with trapped light, layers of translucent blue and green frozen in graceful waves. It was like stepping inside the memory of an ocean. Further in, the passage widened into a chamber. The floor was uneven, littered with remnants half buried in frost, torn blankets, bits of fabric, twisted metal, and rusted tools. "It's a camp," Amelia whispered, "a survival camp." Dr. Manning crouched beside a half-collapsed structure of frozen tarpaulin and examined what remained of a lantern, a notebook, a row of tins. "They must have tried to wait it out here," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands shook as she brushed the snow from a metal thermos. "Some of them must have survived the crash. For a while." Raphael lifted one of the notebooks carefully. The pages were fused together, brittle with age, but the ink was still visible beneath the frost. He handed it to Solomon, who opened it slowly, reading aloud in a low, steady voice. "Day 4. The storm hasn't stopped. Engine's gone. Cold inside, even with fire. The captain says rescue will come soon, but we all know better. Some are talking about the cave to the north. If we stay with the plane, we die. If we go, we die slower." The entries continued, uneven and fading. Day 6. We moved. 10 of us. The others stayed. The cold took 2 last night. The fire keeps going, but I don't feel it anymore. Solomon's voice trembled slightly as he turned the final page. The last words were short, scratched out in jagged lines. "There's something in the ice, watching us. It moves when the wind stops." A deep silence followed. No one moved. Only the faint drip of melting frost broke the stillness. Dr. Manning took a long breath, her face pale. "We should leave," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Amelia pointed her light deeper into the cave. "There's another passage," she murmured. "Look." The beam illuminated a narrow corridor leading downward, the ice here darker, older. The walls seemed to breathe with faint vapor, as if the cave itself exhaled. They followed the path cautiously, each footstep echoing hollowly in the confined space. The air grew warmer still, and Solomon realized why. The glacier wasn't solid here. Somewhere beneath them, Geothermal heat seeped up from the earth, creating pockets of life in the middle of death. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of unease became. The light seemed thinner, the shadows heavier. Solomon could hear the faint rasp of his own breath mingling with the sound of the others behind him. Then, as he turned a bend, his lamp caught something ahead, something pale and still. They found the bodies in a shallow alcove. 5 of them, seated or lying close together, their faces preserved in the clarity of ice. The missing passengers. Their expressions were serene, almost peaceful, as though they had simply fallen asleep. Amelia gasped softly, covering her mouth. Dr. Manning's lamp trembled in her grip. "It's them," she said, "the ones who left the plane." Raphael crouched near one of them, his scientific detachment fraying. "They must have made it here and died of exposure," he said. "But the preservation, this is—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Solomon knelt beside the nearest body, an older man whose hands were still clasped around a leather-bound book. He hesitated before prying it loose. Inside, the pages were covered in the same handwriting as the previous journal. The last entry was dated days after the others had stopped writing. "The light comes from below now. We hear it at night, moving through the ice like water. I think it's alive. If we die here, maybe it will remember us." He closed the book and bowed his head for a moment. These men had lived long enough to hope, then died with that hope still frozen around them. Dr. Manning straightened, swallowing hard. "We've documented what we can," she said. "Let's go." But just as she turned to leave, a sound echoed from the depths of the cave, a slow, rhythmic scraping. It was faint at first, barely more than a vibration in the floor, but it grew steadily louder. The lamps flickered as if something massive moved beyond their light. "Back," Raphael hissed. "Back, now." They retreated toward the main chamber, the noise following them. Solomon turned once, raising his light, and froze. Out of the darkness, 2 eyes shone back at him, pale and steady. For an instant, they seemed almost human. Then the shape emerged fully into view, and his breath caught in his throat. A polar bear stood at the far end of the corridor, its fur ghost white against the ice, steam rising from its body in faint waves. Beside it, 2 small cubs pressed close to her legs, their dark eyes wide and uncertain. The great animal didn't move closer, only watched them with a kind of weary intelligence, her nostrils flaring as she scented the air. Amelia whispered something in Spanish, a prayer or a plea. The bear tilted her head, then gave a low, rumbling sound. Solomon understood immediately. This was her den. She hadn't hunted them, she had followed the warmth, the same as they had. The strange movements, the tracks, the noises in the night, all of it had been her. A mother surviving in the only way she could, guarding her young among the relics of the dead. He raised a hand slowly, palms open, lowering his gaze to the ground. "Easy now," he murmured. "We didn't mean to trespass." His voice was calm, steady, a tone born of years at sea when one wrong sound could mean disaster. The bear blinked once, then shifted her weight. The cubs pressed closer to her. For a long moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, the bear retreated into the deeper shadows, her cubs following. When she was gone, the silence that remained was almost sacred. Dr. Manning exhaled shakily, lowering her light. "We're leaving," she whispered, and this time no one argued. They moved carefully back through the tunnels, every step deliberate, every sound amplified in the frozen stillness. When at last they reached the surface, the pale sun hung low over the horizon, painting the ice in shades of gold and silver. The world looked new again, washed clean by storm and revelation. They stood for a long time at the cave's mouth, none of them speaking. Behind them lay the proof of human endurance, the journals, the bodies, the traces of lives swallowed by time. But, deeper still, beyond human reach, life continued. The bear and her cubs would live, because even here, at the edge of the world, life found a way to persist. Solomon looked back once more before turning away. He felt no fear now, only reverence. The Arctic had not sought to destroy them, it had simply demanded that they see it, truly see it, as something alive, immense, and eternal. When they began their walk back to camp, the wind rose gently at their backs, carrying with it the faint, hollow sound of the glacier shifting, like a sigh of relief. It was as if the ice itself had approved of their leaving. When the wind finally ceased its long wailing over the ice, the world seemed to pause in reverence. The storm's memory still clung to the air, a ghost that whispered in the hollow spaces between heartbeats. The sun lay low on the horizon, a pale ember barely visible through the clouds. For the first time in days, the silence felt gentle instead of threatening. It was the kind of quiet that followed truth, the quiet of acceptance. Solomon stood apart from the others, his breath curling in thin ribbons of mist. The cave behind them was just another dark wound in the landscape now, sealed by snow and shadow. Nothing in its stillness betrayed the secrets it held within. The bodies of the lost, the journals of despair, the white guardian that had outlived them all. He felt the memory of that creature still upon him, the calm power of her gaze, the steady rhythm of her breathing echoing the heartbeat of the land itself. The Arctic, he realized, was not dead. It was alive in a way humankind had forgotten how to understand. Dr. Mannon moved methodically around the camp, checking equipment, cataloging samples, recording voice notes. Her movements were precise, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. The mask of authority she had worn since they set sail was cracked now, revealing something raw and human beneath. When she caught Solomon watching her, she gave a faint, wry smile. "You were right," she said quietly. "The world does keep its own memories. We just dig too deep to find them." He said nothing but inclined his head. She turned away, her voice dropping into the recorder, dictating a report that would never truly capture what they had seen. Amelia stood by the ridge, gazing toward the horizon where the ice met the sea. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her expression distant, as if she were listening for something that only she could hear. Raphael was beside her, unusually silent, staring at the frozen aircraft that still jutted from the snow in the distance. Its metallic skin gleamed faintly in the sunlight, almost beautiful again. It no longer looked like a tomb, it looked like a relic, something sacred and untouchable. The hours passed slowly. They spent the day gathering what little equipment they could salvage. The storm had claimed most of their supplies, scattering them across the ice like offerings to the void. Their communication devices were damaged beyond repair, and the ship still gave no signal. Yet no one panicked. The urgency that had driven them before was gone, replaced by a strange calmness. They had looked into the frozen heart. By late afternoon, a new light began to spread across the sky. The aurora returned, pale at first, then deepening into waves of green and violet that shimmered across the heavens. The ice reflected it, turning the whole landscape into a sea of liquid light. It was as if the world itself had come alive, breathing color and fire after centuries of sleep. Dr. Manning ordered the final preparations for departure. The Resolute had reestablished weak radio contact earlier that day, and rescue crews were on their way through the shift in ice. They would leave at dawn. Yet none of them could bring themselves to dismantle the camp just yet. Each stood for a while, staring at the plane one last time. Solomon approached the wreckage alone. The snow was deep, but he moved with the patience of a man who had walked this road before. The closer he came, the more clearly he could see the letters along the side. Aero, Atlantica, Flight 209. Time had stripped them of paint, but not meaning. The door was closed again, sealed by frost, as though the world had decided to give the dead back their peace. He laid his hand on the metal. Beneath the ice, he could still feel a pulse. Not a sound, not even a vibration, just the faint suggestion of life that lingered in everything touched by memory. "You made it home, Isaiah," he whispered. The words drifted away into the cold, soft and sure. For the first time, he felt no ache when he spoke his brother's name. The years of guilt, of wondering, of imagining that final descent, all of it dissolved into the stillness around him. His brother's promise had been kept after all. The plane had not vanished. It had merely found a place beyond reach, preserved by the one force that asks for nothing and keeps everything: the ice. When he turned back toward camp, Amelia was waiting. Her expression was gentle but questioning. "Did you find what you came for?" she asked. Solomon looked past her toward the horizon, where the aurora rippled like an ocean above them. "I think I found what I'd forgotten to look for," he said. "Peace." That night, they built a small fire near the shelter. It burned blue in the thin air, its smoke rising straight into the windless dark. No one spoke much. Words felt too small, too clumsy to describe what they had witnessed. The light from the flames danced across their faces, etching them in shades of gold and shadow. Raphael stared into the fire as though trying to find equations there. Amelia hummed a soft melody under her breath, a tune without beginning or end. Dr. Manning sat beside the recorder again, but this time she did not dictate. She only listened to the crackle of fire, the creak of shifting ice, the quiet rhythm of human hearts that had survived together. When the flames began to fade, Solomon rose. He walked a few paces away, out into the open. Above him, the aurora was stronger now, painting the entire sky in ribbons of green, pink, and silver. It moved like the sea in a dream. He thought of all the years he had spent near water, storms and ports, harbors and horizons, and realized this place, though frozen, was no different. The Arctic was an ocean, too, only slower, deeper, patient beyond comprehension. Behind him, the others settled into their tents. The night grew colder, and the stars appeared through the veil of light. He stayed awake, unable to tear his eyes from the sky. Somewhere beyond that vast shimmer, his brother's last flight had once traced its line across the same heavens. Perhaps, he thought, everything eventually returns to where it began. When dawn arrived, the sound of engines broke the silence. The rescue craft appeared as dark specks against the endless white, cutting through the low clouds. The Resolute was alive and waiting beyond the ice shelf. They packed their remaining gear and began the slow journey back. As they walked, Solomon turned one last time to look at the wreck. The aurora had faded now, replaced by a pale band of sunlight. The aircraft stood in quiet dignity, half buried once more, the snow already reclaiming it. It would remain there for centuries, perhaps forever, untouched by greed or curiosity. A monument not only to loss but to endurance. Hours later, aboard the ship, the world felt almost too warm, too loud. The hum of the engines and the chatter of relieved crewmen seemed foreign after so much stillness. Dr. Manning spent the evening cataloging their data, her words precise, but there was a tremor in her tone when she spoke of the discovery. Raphael stared at the frozen samples as though they held some great paradox he could never solve. Amelia stood by the railing, watching the horizon. By late afternoon, a new light began to spread across the sky. The aurora returned, pale at first, then deepening into waves of green and violet that shimmered across the heavens. The ice reflected it, turning the whole landscape into a sea of liquid light. It was as if the world itself had come alive, breathing color and fire after centuries of sleep. Dr. Manning ordered the final preparations for departure. The Resolute had reestablished weak radio contact earlier that day, and rescue crews were on their way through the shifting ice. They would leave at dawn. Yet none of them could bring themselves to dismantle the camp just yet. Each stood for a while, staring at the plane one last time. Solomon approached the wreckage alone. The snow was deep, but he moved with the patience of a man who had walked this road before. The closer he came, the more clearly he could see the letters along the side. Aero, Atlantica, Flight 209. Time had stripped them of paint, but not meaning. The door was closed again, sealed by frost, as though the world had decided to give the dead back their peace. He laid his hand on the metal. Beneath the ice, he could still feel a pulse. Not a sound, not even a vibration, just the faint suggestion of life that lingered in everything touched by memory. "You made it home, Isaiah," he whispered. The words drifted away into the cold, soft and sure. For the first time, he felt no ache when he spoke his brother's name. The years of guilt, of wondering, of imagining that final descent, all of it dissolved into the stillness around him. His brother's promise had been kept after all. The plane had not vanished. It had merely found a place beyond reach, preserved by the one force that asks for nothing and keeps everything, the ice. When he turned back toward camp, Amelia was waiting. Her expression was gentle but questioning. "Did you find what you came for?" she asked. Solomon looked past her toward the horizon, where the aurora rippled like an ocean above them. "I think I found what I'd forgotten to look for," he said. "Peace." That night, they built a small fire near the shelter. It burned blue in the thin air, its smoke rising straight into the windless dark. No one spoke much. Words felt too small, too clumsy to describe what they had witnessed. The light from the flames danced across their faces, etching them in shades of gold and shadow. Raphael stared into the fire as though trying to find equations there. Amelia hummed a soft melody under her breath, a tune without beginning or end. Dr. Manning sat beside the recorder again, but this time she did not dictate. She only listened to the crackle of fire, the creak of shifting ice, the quiet rhythm of human hearts that had survived together. When the flames began to fade, Solomon rose. He walked a few paces away, out into the open. Above him, the aurora was stronger now, painting the entire sky in ribbons of green, pink, and silver. It moved like the sea in a dream. He thought of all the years he had spent near water, storms and ports, harbors and horizons, and realized this place, though frozen, was no different. The Arctic was an ocean, too, only slower, deeper, patient beyond comprehension. Behind him, the others settled into their tents. The night grew colder, and the stars appeared through the veil of light. He stayed awake, unable to tear his eyes from the sky. Somewhere beyond that vast shimmer, his brother's last flight had once traced its line across the same heavens. Perhaps, he thought, everything eventually returns to where it began. When dawn arrived, the sound of engines broke the silence. The rescue craft appeared as dark specks against the endless white, cutting through the low clouds. The Resolute was alive and waiting beyond the ice shelf. They packed their remaining gear and began the slow journey back. As they walked, Solomon turned one last time to look at the wreck. The aurora had faded now, replaced by a pale band of sunlight. The aircraft stood in quiet dignity, half buried once more, the snow already reclaiming it. It would remain there for centuries, perhaps forever, untouched by greed or curiosity. A monument not only to loss but to endurance. Hours later, aboard the ship, the world felt almost too warm, too loud. The hum of the engines and the chatter of relieved crewmen seemed foreign after so much stillness. Dr. Manning spent the evening cataloging their data, her words precise. But there was a tremor in her tone when she spoke of the discovery. Raphael stared at the frozen samples as though they held some great paradox he could never solve.